On April 21, 2026, the cabinet of Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi formally ended Japan's ban on the export of lethal weapons, a ban that had been in place since 1967, and that was built on the foundation of Article 9 of the 1947 pacifist constitution. The announcement came on X. It was less than 200 words. Takaichi said that no single country can now protect its own peace and security alone. She said partner countries must support each other in an increasingly severe security environment. She said this was consistent with Japan's 80-year commitment to pacifism. 2 days earlier, 36,000 Japanese citizens had rallied outside the National Diet Building to say the opposite. Placards read, "No to war. Do not undermine Article 9. Takaichi stepped down. Polls showed that 70% of even her own party's voters opposed the constitutional direction she was taking. China's foreign ministry called it, quote, reckless moves toward a new type of militarism. The announcement was covered for a news cycle and then moved on. What almost no one said out loud was this: Japan has rearmed 3 times in its modern history. The first 2 times ended in catastrophe on a scale that is almost impossible to describe. This is the 3rd time. This is precedent. And today we are drawing the line on the single most consistent pattern in the history of modern Japan. The pattern that says every rearmament cycle looks defensive from the inside, and every rearmament cycle ends the same way. In December of 1937, the Imperial Japanese Army entered the Chinese city of Nanjing. What happened over the next 6 weeks is, by the consensus of historians, one of the worst atrocities committed during the Second World War. The Japanese army killed an estimated 300,000 Chinese civilians and disarmed soldiers. Women were raped in numbers the International Military Tribunal for the Far East later documented as, quote, at least 20,000 cases in the first month. Bodies were thrown into the Yangtze River in numbers large enough that eyewitnesses described the water running red for days. Photographs taken by Japanese soldiers themselves and smuggled out by Western missionaries are some of the most infamous images of the 20th century. This was not an accident. It was not the work of rogue units. It was the direct operational consequence of a rearmament cycle that had begun decades earlier, and that had, by 1937, produced an army that believed itself entitled to act without restraint. 4 years later, on the morning of December 7, 1941, 6 aircraft carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy launched 353 aircraft against the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. 2,400 Americans were killed in under 2 hours. 4 battleships were sunk. The Pacific Fleet was crippled. The Second World War in the Pacific had begun. By the time it ended, in August of 1945, the war that Japan's rearmament had produced had killed over 80 million people worldwide. 2 Japanese cities had been destroyed by atomic weapons. The Japanese Empire had ceased to exist. This is what the last rearmament of Japan produced. It is the direct historical context for what happened on Tuesday. And now we need to understand how it started, because the way it started is what makes the current moment dangerous. To understand where Japan is going, you have to understand where Japan has been. The first rearmament cycle began in 1868, 158 years ago, with an event called the Meiji Restoration. For 2.5 centuries before the Meiji Restoration, Japan had been a closed, feudal society under the Tokugawa shogunate. No military, no navy, no foreign contact. When Commodore Matthew Perry's American warships sailed into Tokyo Bay in 1853 and forced Japan to open its ports at gunpoint, the Japanese ruling class understood something fundamental. A country without a modern military did not get to decide its own future. The Meiji Restoration was Japan's answer. In 1868, the Tokugawa shogunate was overthrown, the emperor was restored to symbolic authority, and Japan committed itself to what it called, quote, Fuko-Ku Kyo-hei. Rich country, strong army. Within 30 years, Japan had built a modern industrial economy, a European-style army, and a navy capable of defeating the Russian Empire, which is exactly what it did. In 1904, Japan attacked the Russian Pacific Fleet at Port Arthur, a surprise attack on a modern battle fleet that bears striking structural similarities to the attack it would launch against the United States at Pearl Harbor 37 years later. In May of 1905, the Japanese fleet annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet at the Battle of Tsushima. It was the first time in the modern era that an Asian power had decisively defeated a European great power. The shockwave reshaped global politics. And here is the part that matters. Every step in this process, the Meiji military buildup, the invasion of Korea in 1895, the defeat of Russia in 1905, the annexation of Korea in 1910, was justified by the Japanese government in the same language: regional security. a severe security environment, the inability of any single nation to defend itself alone, partner relationships, modernization, self-defense. The language was not cynical. The Japanese leadership believed it. And then the logic of the military buildup took on its own momentum. And by the 1930s, the army that had been built to defend Japan from European colonialism was the army that marched into Manchuria, and then into Nanjing, and then into the rest of Asia. The second rearmament cycle began on the night of September 18, 1931, outside the Manchurian city of Mukden. Officers of Japan's Kwantung Army detonated a small explosive on a section of the South Manchurian Railway and blamed Chinese dissidents. The damage was so minor that a train passed over the tracks minutes later, but the pretext was enough. Within hours, the Kwantung Army had launched a full-scale invasion of Manchuria. Japan's civilian government in Tokyo did not authorize this invasion. They learned about it from the newspapers, but the military told the civilian government that the invasion was necessary for regional security, for the protection of Japanese economic interests, for stability in a dangerous neighborhood. The civilian government, which had no practical ability to control its own military, accepted the argument. This is the pattern. Once the military has the capability to act independently, the civilian government stops setting policy and starts explaining it. 6 years later, in 1937, the same army that had taken Manchuria launched a full-scale invasion of China. 6 months after that, it entered Nanjing. 4 years after that, it attacked Pearl Harbor. At every step, the Japanese government used the same language: a severe security environment, the need for partner relationships with friendly nations, the inability of Japan to defend its interests alone, the necessity of regional stability, the obligation to support allies. Every individual step looked defensive. The cumulative trajectory was genocidal. By August of 1945, the war that had started with a staged railway bombing in Manchuria in 1931 had killed over 80 million people worldwide. It had consumed the industrial capacity of 5 continents. It had produced the first and only use of atomic weapons against civilian populations. It had ended the European colonial empires and reshaped the global order. And it had started, on the ground, with a series of announcements that sounded, in their own time, completely reasonable. Partner relationships, regional stability, a severe security environment, no single country able to defend itself alone. That language should sound familiar. It is, almost word for word, what Prime Minister Takaichi posted on X on Tuesday, which brings us back to April 21st, 2026. Japan is not the Japan of 1931. Prime Minister Takaichi is not Hideki Tokujo. The Japan Self-Defense Forces are not the Kwantung Army. The 2026 arms export revision does not commit Japan to a war with anyone. The United States is a treaty ally of Japan and not, as it was in 1941, on a collision course with Japanese expansion. None of those differences change the pattern. The pattern is this: Japan militarized 3 times in its modern history. Every time the individual steps looked defensive. Every time the language used to justify each step was almost identical. Partner relationships, severe security environment, no country able to defend itself alone. Every time, the cumulative trajectory took on a momentum that the civilian government eventually could not control. 2 of the 3 times, that trajectory ended in historical catastrophe. On Tuesday, Takaichi announced that Japan is now exporting weapons to 17 countries. Last week, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries signed a deal to build 11 warships for Australia worth over $15 billion. The largest Japanese arms deal since 1945. In November, Takaichi declared that Japan would join any U.S. war against China over Taiwan. In recent months, the Japanese Ministry of Defense has deployed long-range missiles exceeding 1,000 kilometers in range, an explicit departure from the exclusively defensive posture of the last 80 years. Every one of those steps, taken individually, is defensible. Each one responds to a specific and real external threat. China is genuinely more aggressive. Taiwan is genuinely more vulnerable. The regional security environment is, in Takaichi's exact language, genuinely more severe. That is exactly what makes this dangerous, because that is also exactly what was true in 1868, and in 1931, and in 1937, and in 1941. The question is not whether Japan has good reasons to rearm. Japan has always had good reasons to rearm. The question is whether good reasons, applied consistently over years and decades, produce the same cumulative outcome they have produced the last 2 times Japan did this. The 36,000 Japanese citizens who stood outside the National Diet Building on Sunday are the descendants of the people who lived through what happened the last time Japan did this. They are not protesting because they believe Takaichi is lying. They are protesting because they know the pattern, and they are begging the rest of the world to notice it before it compounds into something that cannot be undone. History does not tell us that the third rearmament of Japan will end the way the second one did. It tells us that the pattern of Japanese rearmament is one of the most consistent and dangerous patterns in the history of the modern era, and that the people closest to that pattern are the ones most alarmed by what just happened. History doesn't repeat itself, but it sets a precedent.